America's Rising Tensions Over Transgenderism.
A lot of these, in recent of these trans shooters that we've seen over the last couple incidents, this flag right here is up and down 14th Street. This is what would be a trans flag. A lot of people are very threatened by this flag. It means a lot of different negative things to people, violence. Would you be opposed to taking this flag down up and down the streets of DC?
Well, I wouldn't be. Then they'll sue and they'll get freedom of speech stuff, so that'll happen. But I would have no problem with it.
Another Donald Trump press conference. Jessica, what was this one about?
So this week, a prominent and influential conservative think tank in the U.S. published a statement urging the FBI to create a new form of domestic terrorism called transgender ideology-inspired violent extremism, which is a bit of a mouthful, but for short, it's TIVE or TIVE or TIVE. I'm not sure how they're pronouncing it, but TIVE is the acronym.
And who's the think tank and why have they done it?
Yeah, so the group that put this forward is called the Oversight Project, and they're part of the Heritage Foundation. And the Heritage Foundation is the think tank that created Project 2025, which is the rather infamous playbook that many say has been really informing the Trump administration thus far, shaping everything from like environmental policy to reproductive rights decisions. And by current tracking, about 50% of the Project 2025 agenda has now been implemented by the Trump administration.
Wow, is it that high?
8 months in.
Yeah, because I actually first heard about Project 2025 on this here show. Someone, I would credit them, but I can't remember who brought it to us as their story. And at the time, even in our discussion, we were saying, well, even if Trump wins, even if this is a covert plan to implement some right-wing policies that they're saying they won't, how many realistically are going to get through? No one would have guessed 50%, and he's not done yet.
Oh, he's nowhere near done. Given that, it's not completely outrageous that the Trump administration and the FBI would listen, would at least entertain this proposal from this group. And so, I mean, we can look at sort of what this classification would mean. It'd be a new form of domestic terrorism that's specifically focused on trans rights, groups that support trans rights. And they're sort of couching it by, like, it's a blurry definition. And in their document, they say that it would only apply to people or groups who are motivated by an ideology that encourages or condones violence and takes or incites violent acts based on that ideology. So based on this trans ideology. And this is coming from, I mean, there have been some really awful and high profile acts of violence lately. One of them in particular was a shooting in Minneapolis that was, the shooter was a trans person. And then the recent murder of Charlie Kirk, the shooter's partner was reportedly trans. And so the Republicans and the far right in America have latched onto this as being evidence that there is this movement in America of trans people who are very violent and that they want to target their opponents, and that this warrants some sort of terrorism qualification that would allow the government to really crack down on them.
Yes. I mean, there does seem to be, Felicity, albeit it is right-wing sources making us aware of this mostly, but there does seem to be some links to some trans people in some incidents of extreme violence this year. If that evidence does stack up, if it's kind of disproportionate numbers, then it is reasonable, isn't it, to inquire as to why?
Yes, to some extent, although the first thing I would say on that is that I think you need a lot of caution in trying to ascertain what the motivation or ideology behind a perpetrator of any violence is going to be. So, like, putting together statistics on this sort of thing, I think is going to be very problematic and very contentious. It is true that there have been some cases in recent years. So there was the case of Robin Westman, the 23-year-old former student who killed 2 children and injured 18, was transgender and reportedly wrote in their diary that they were tired of being trans, and that seems to be picked up. I mean, how much that was a factor in what they then did, like I said, is very hard to, ascertain. And there was a 2023 mass shooting at the convent school in Nashville. Again, the police said it was by a former student who was transgender. So if there is a trend, and I'm not entirely convinced there is, then yes, I guess it would be worthwhile monitoring that trend, of course. Denying that a minority group is capable of harbouring extremists just because they're from a minority group doesn't make sense. On the other side, of course, people are going to, right-wing groups are going to, grab hold of this and run with it for their own ends. What I do think is true is that violent extremists today come from across the political spectrum. It is from both the right wing and the left wing. And I read a very interesting piece in The Atlantic, actually, that said 2025 marks the first time in more than 30 years that left-wing attacks outnumber those from the far right. So 37 incidents from 2016 to 2024. And that's partly, obviously, because of Trump's election. So I guess extremists on the right feel maybe there's less need to. But you always see that swing. So when Obama was elected, that corresponded with a surge of violence from the right. So it does seem to flip around in quite a kind of obvious way. Left-wing violence used to be a lot more prominent, especially in the 60s and the 70s. You had the Symbionese Liberation Army. They were the group that kidnapped Patty Hearst and the Weather Underground. And then it sort of switched back in the 80s and 90s with the rise of more right-wing and jihadist terrorism. It's a murky picture for sure, but it's not to say that left-wing violence doesn't exist and violence by trans people doesn't exist, because it does.
Yeah, I mean, I know, Jessica, you want to talk about what it's like for trans people in America today, and we'll get there in a moment. But just on this issue of killings and violent extremism in the United States, from my perspective, it's quite interesting to see, this focus now on trans ideology-inspired violent extremism is a bit of a mask for not talking about just online radicalism in general. People who are so immersed in whatever idea it is and see nothing else because that's what they follow on social media, including Trump supporters, of course, that, isn't the bigger thing that's going on here. It just seems to me, watching this from across the pond, James Marriott wrote a great piece about this for The Times last week, a kind of narcissism, nihilism, objection to everyone, plague on all your houses type thing, which is going on, which comes from the internet. Like it's not about trans ideology per se, it's spending too much time online.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I want to talk about that. But first I want to come back and just address your question to Felicity, because there are numbers that kind of underscore how few mass shootings are carried out by trans people. Over the last few decades, it's been like less than 1%. I mean, they account for so few of the mass shootings that have been carried out in the U.S. Most of them are carried out by young, white, cis men. So I think that's really important to underscore. Not all of them, obviously, but that is a really important thing to say. And also it's important to remember that nearly 2/3 of the deadly incidents of violence against trans people and gender nonconforming people involve a gun. So they are much more likely to be targeted by gun violence. And many of the acts of violence against them are perpetrated by people with a gun. So just to make that very clear. Back to your original question. So yes, so there is this growing instance of people committing violence for what seems to be sort of like no clear reason, aside from the fact that they're really sort of disillusioned with the world. And so this is why actually the FBI has created a new classification as well, another new classification for terrorism called nihilistic violent extremism.
Oh, right.
And this is exactly what you're talking about. It's NVE, and it's for groups that don't have a sort of single ideological framework that's motivating their actions. It's sort of a catch-all for people who, like you say, have spent a lot of time online, are feeling very disillusioned by the world, feel like the world is against them, everything is going badly, and it's rooted in online extremism, and they don't know what else to do, and so they act out, and it's sort of it's like attempting to like hasten the collapse of society basically through their acts of violence. And so the FBI has already created this classification that serves as a sort of catch-all. And there was a report that the FBI was considering this catch-all nihilistic violent extremism classification for trans groups. And then after that dovetailed with the Heritage Foundation actually saying, no, let's go a bit further and make it more specific. Let's make it specifically about trans people and trans groups, not just lumping them in. And so it just gives them more of it would give the FBI more of the capabilities to specifically look at trans groups and trans right groups.
I mean, I suppose the point is, Felicity, if there was an example of someone who believed so firmly in trans ideology and was so opposed to a particular person that they went out there and killed them as a result of their contrary views, maybe it's useful to have a term that encompasses what that means, that particular kind of violent activity. But what isn't at all clear from this new labelling of trans ideology-inspired violent extremism is that the ideology itself is violent. And the ideology could be as simple as we were just hearing from President Trump there, displaying a flag.
Yeah, definitely. There is definite overreach. And I think particularly in the wake of Charlie Kirk, I sort of feel like the levels of hysteria and that kind of witch hunt of, going after people and targeting groups unfairly is probably reaching like heightened, extreme, hysterical proportions. And it must be awful to suddenly find yourself being targeted as potentially being more likely to be violent or extremist based on, as you say, your points of view or your way of living of how things should be, which are not remotely violent at all. I think it's tricky because the TIVE, the TIVE, explicitly says violence and extremism. I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to go after individuals who do have nefarious aims, who are violent, who are extremist. I think there is a problem if that obviously then bleeds into very, very unfairly targeting entire groups of people who have absolutely, I think a lot of trans people actually really just want to live quietly and in dignity and in peace and don't want all this attention brought on them.
Yeah, one of the examples that struck me, Jess, in the tweet that this think tank put out sort of announcing this new idea, is they sort of expanded on examples where this might happen. And one example was someone who in their labelling is trans ideology inspired might say in a debate about trans people's very existence, so someone might be being told basically their identity doesn't exist or their child's identity doesn't exist. One of the arguments they might recourse to is, well, it's better to have a boy who's alive than a dead girl, or vice versa. That's a comment that comes up a lot because of the unfortunately high rate of suicides that affect people who are trans. And it's saying that is an act of violent extremism, because by saying it, you're saying to the person who thinks that trans people should be assigned only the sex they had at birth, that they are killing someone. That's not what you're saying. I find that strange.
No.
I mean, it's just clearly not what you're saying. It's a way of saying, well, better to let someone live the way they want than take their own life. I mean, that seems like a straightforward thing to say. It's not violent. And yet that is how this new idea would depict it.
Yeah, and it's all very open to interpretation. And you can see a lot of room for, like I said, basically inserting your own views and taking things out of context. I mean, the part of that document that you're referring to is a list of things that the Heritage Foundation has said that violent trans people might say in conversation. And some of the other words were really things that we all have probably said: cisgender, misgendering, right to exist, like words that are very common in modern conversation. And I think what this serves to do, I think it serves to give people a playbook by which to look for and target trans people. I think the risk here is that it generally makes people feel more unsafe around trans people, and it will make them be targeted more. Trans people will be targeted more because of this kind of declaration and categorization. It doesn't matter what the details say, really, because very few people read the details. Very few people read the fine print in this kind of classification. All they will say, and all the headlines will say, is that trans groups have been categorized as violent extremists and as terrorists, and people will take that and run with it. And I think it's really important to underscore that, like, this kind of a classification, saying something is domestic terrorism, allows the government to sidestep the First Amendment, which is why we saw the reporter and Trump talking about this idea of taking down the trans rights flags, right? Whereas in any other world, that would be a free speech issue, that you're allowed to fly those flags because it's a First Amendment right. But if you are labeled as a domestic terrorist, that trumps your ability to have free speech. That goes above and beyond. So it allows them to sort of sidestep. And I think what it would also allow them to do is ramp up surveillance and monitoring of these groups, people who already feel really unsafe in their environments. So I think it's quite it's a really tense time.
Yes, and this isn't happening in isolation, is it, Felicity? There have been numerous changes that have come to pass, things that have changed since Trump came into power, which discriminate against trans people in a variety of different settings.
Yes, that is true. So almost immediately upon taking office, Trump moved to end DEI programs, diversity, equity and inclusion, and kind of made it quite clear that government departments would only recognise 2 genders. And that was broadly in line with Project 2025's aims, which in its kind of like manifesto of, you know, the wish list of how this government should be run, it took aim at DEI and gender terminology, and that was part of like a wider crackdown on woke ideology. So it's quite clear that is the intention that, you know, Trump has set out, that, you know, that's what he wants to bring about with this government.
And a ban on trans people serving in the military as well, Jess.
Yeah. He banned transgender people from serving in the military.
And this isn't a case just on that. It's not a case of like what bathroom they use or whatever. It's about saying people who are trans have perhaps some kind of mental disorder is the philosophy behind it. Therefore, they can't serve in the American military because they need too much medical attention. That's basically what his government edict says.
Yeah. And I mean, there are lots of other examples of so in the budget bill, the reconciliation bill, the one big beautiful bill tried to remove coverage for transgender healthcare. That was removed, but it tried. He wrote an executive order that said that passports could only list the sex that you were assigned at birth. And that has been challenged by courts, I think overturned. Another executive order banning trans women from women's sports. And then there was another just astounding report, actually, that the Department of Justice is considering banning trans people from owning guns, which, again, like, it's just kind of shocking because never has that been suggested ever after a mass shooting committed by a white male. It's kind of stunning.
And Felicity, we always, on a weekly basis, try and focus on this show on underreported stories. And the underreported element, I guess, here is the net result of what this might mean for trans people in America. But certainly, like, the trans issue, if you call it that in inverted commas, is not underreported. It's constantly there on social media. People feel like whether they are trans or know any trans people or have ever met a trans person, they can have a view on this and really define their social profile to an extent with what they say about this. So why is that? Why has this become such a lightning rod issue? Is it just being doubled down on now because Trump knows it plays well with his base?
I'm sure that is partly true, that it does definitely play well with his base. I mean, certainly stateside, again, in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination and this talk of like there now being a war, it definitely all seems like far more febrile and you know, it seems like the two sides of the political spectrum are even more far apart than ever. I was reading an argument that said, you know, extremists are on both sides of the political divide, but we have to find a way to disagree better. And I certainly don't think we're going in that direction at the moment. The trans issue has long been so controversial and so contested. And just to bring it back to the UK side, I was reading a review of Nicola Sturgeon's recent memoir, and obviously it was an issue that basically brought about her downfall. And I think she partly feels that she, could have done more, maybe to listen to the other side, to listen to gender critical activists a bit more. She maintains that the recent conversation in this country, we will look back on it in decades to come and be absolutely horrified how trans people were treated at this time. But obviously on the other side you have gender critical activists who want to make their voice heard and want to kind of protect the rights of women that they see as being under threat. So I don't see the debate going away anytime soon. It is just that we have to learn to debate it better and leave violence and extremism out of it on both sides.
And Jessica, as an American looking at Project 2025, what's left of the things that might yet be implemented that worries you?
So there's actually a website that helps to track Project 2025 and its various initiatives. And just looking at what's sort of in progress but hasn't been completed, here are a few things. So in progress, the Department of State suspend all visas to people from countries that do not accept the return of immigrants ordered deported. The White House wants to cut off government contracts to entities that enforce a woke agenda. Downsize the Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research because it focuses on too much climate alarmism. So these are things that are in progress. There are other things that have not yet started. So, for example, fund studies into the risks and complications of abortion, weaken regulations on baby formula.
Because when we first discussed this, Trump's answer when he was trying to get elected was, I've never heard of Project 2025, I don't know what it is. Have the White House stopped saying that now? Do they admit that this is a template?
I am fairly certain that there are people from Project 2025 that are in or closely advising the Trump administration now. So whether or not they come out and say we are implementing Project 2025, I don't know that they've actually come out and said that, but I don't know that they necessarily need to.